Hi, my name is Michael Chikeen. The smartest people I've met have one common belief, that us silly humans really don't know much. For example, we still don't know why planes stay in the air, or how Tylenol or even gravity works. Yeah, gravity. Look it up. In today's distracted, clickbait, misinformation age, I wish we could all be less certain, more humble, and a lot more curious. Admittedly, I've been known to struggle with all three. So no more, no less, this show is my attempt to be that change. Thanks for joining me, and here we go. Hey everybody, welcome back to No More, No Less. I'm your host, Michael Chikeen, and today I'm very excited and honored to have Carl Safina with me today in the studio. Carl is an American ecologist and acclaimed nonfiction writer. His books focusing on the human relationship with the living world have won a MacArthur Genius Prize, a Pew, Guggenheim, and National Science Foundation fellowships, book awards from the National Academies and the Lannan Foundation, and Orion Magazine and the John Burroughs, James Beard, and George Rabb medals. Carl's written 10 books in all, 2 of which have been New York Times Notable Books of the Year, including his most recent, Becoming Wild, which explores animal cultures and how much wisdom and intelligence humans miss from the animal kingdom, and how we have a moral duty to preserve the natural world if we wish for any chance of preserving our own human dignity. There is so much for us to discuss, so let's dive in. Carl Safina, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a great honor to be with you.
Well, something I want to touch on briefly that I was reading in your bio. As the guy mentioned, we're both descended from Italian immigrants, and I noticed that you mentioned you were collecting or playing with pigeons and tracking hawks and all of these things in your youth, and it seems to be such a large part of what's driven you to write all these wonderful, beautiful books. And I hope you could speak for just a moment about your childhood and any memories you have that really sunk this natural world into your being that made you want to be such an advocate for it for so long.
Yeah, I think part of it is a little inexplicable, but I think part of it is, for my personal story is, I think, easy to recall. For one thing is that I was a city kid. I lived in Brooklyn, New York, where there really was no nature or almost no wild animals around. I think I was 9 years old before I saw a tree that was not planted by a human being. And so to me, animals of any kind were always very exotic and very, very special. There was nothing to be taken for granted because they weren't granted. It always required a special trip to see them. So we would go, my parents would take me to the zoo or the public aquarium or the Museum of Natural History. A lot of kids probably would go to those places and it wouldn't make a big impression on them. The inexplicable part is that for some reason it made a huge impression on me. I was completely taken and fascinated. I always wanted to go back. Those were the special places for me. We would sometimes go to the beach. We would occasionally go fishing. Those were some experiences I had early in the natural world, or at least in naturalistic sort of settings, certainly not wilderness by a long shot. And one thing I do remember that made a huge impression on me was that one night, it must have been, well, it was either the spring or the fall, but it must have been a warm enough night that we had the window open in the apartment, and a bird flew in to our kitchen. I had never seen a bird like this. The only birds I had seen were pigeons and canaries. My father's hobby was breeding canaries. So that was another thing, was that I could watch from inches away as birds made their nests and got on and off these tiny little eggs and fed these impossible-looking small and vulnerable babies. But one night a wild bird flew in, and I had never seen such a thing. My father had one of the very, very first bird field guides. It was nothing like the guides today, but he determined that it was a bird called an olive-backed thrush. I remember that. And what was really amazing to me, I mean, stunning in like a mystical way, was that out of the black night, these things were somehow moving. And in a way, I always related this story of mine to a story I read about Albert Einstein when somebody first showed him a compass as a child. And he was so taken with the fact that there were these invisible forces at work that affected the compass needle, but you couldn't detect them. And in a similar way, I realize, there are birds moving through the black night. Where are they? I've never seen anything like this, but somehow they're out there. And that made a big impression on me. As I said, I always loved animals of all kinds. When I was 7, I started actually raising homing pigeons. I had a flock of homing pigeons. So that was another thing where, and this was maybe the biggest thing that really set me going, was as a little boy, I have a lot of free time because I'm like 7 or 8 years old, right? So I'm in my pigeon coop and I just stand there and I just watch them. I watch them eat, I watch them drink, I watch them figure out who they're going to be mated with, I watch them build their nest, get on and off their eggs, feed and raise their young ones. And basically the way that their life worked was that if you're raising pigeons, you usually have a stack of boxes, and you put a bowl in each box, and they decide who they're going to marry, and they make their house in their little apartment there by building their nest in that bowl. They're out for a few hours every day. They come back and they feed their babies, and then they go to sleep. And right across the yard, we were living in a stack of boxes where people decided who they were going to marry, and like the pigeons, sometimes they fought and squabbled. They made their nest. They left for a few hours every day. They came home and fed their babies, and we went to sleep. And it just seemed to me that our lives were really the same. A lot of the details were different, but the overall connection and the overall sense of relation were the overwhelming commonalities for me.
Wow, and you remember noticing those similarities at such an early age?
Yeah, because nobody told me any differently. It just was obvious. Wow. We were raising babies, they were raising babies. We had our house in our little box, they had their house in their little box.
Right. That's great, because even just listening to you retell some of those stories really has me have a lot of flashbacks of myself growing up with my nonni, my grandparents. And my grandfather would hunt in the local woods sometimes, and this was in the 80s when nobody hunted, not in that park, but he would go find rabbits and bring them home and eat them. And when we'd go visit our relatives in northern Italy, we would go into the mountains for a week. And I remember even going for so many hikes with my father, and now I can think about all the times when nature was all around me, and why this topic is of so much interest to me. But I guess we've always lived in suburbs or cities or wherever, and I never realized the impact that it had on me until even now. And when I read the book The Overstory recently, and it really has got me down this path. And the next one that I'm so excited to read is Becoming Wild, because one of the reasons for this podcast is just trying to have humans that are a little bit more humble in what we know and don't know about the physical world around us, and not to have so much certainty about what we think we know, because there's so much proof that we've had recently in the last 50 years of how we really don't know what the animal kingdom is capable of. For example, we didn't know that dolphins had sonar, for example, how feeling and intelligent animals like pigs were. And it seems like every year there's just something else that comes out, like the hidden life of trees, how they communicate with each other, and all of these magical things.
Right.
And so I was hoping you could speak to how exactly you've gathered enough evidence to make the case in your book that animals do have culture, like humans, like human animals have culture, and maybe we can start by if you could define what culture exactly means in this context first.
Yeah, I think first of all, defining it is the most important thing before we know what we're talking about.
Okay.
But I also want to just comment on something that you said about the information that we have and what we know and what we don't know. On my first day of the class that I teach for graduate students, I ask, what is the value of an education? And you know, a few hands go up and they all say knowledge, or to get a good job, or to learn things. And what I tell them is that at this point, what I think the value of an education is to begin to understand how little we know. That to me is the value of an education.
Amazing.
But so let's talk a little bit about culture. With humans, we say culture is fashion and movies and art and religion and sports and technology. That's culture. And actually, that's not culture. Those are products of culture. What culture is the answer to the question of how do we live here. That's what culture is. And to make that a little bit clearer, one of the most obvious cultural things is our language. Humans are born with a behavioral capability to learn a human-type language. But whether we speak Italian or English or Vietnamese or whatever is strictly a matter of what we are taught. And that's what culture is. Culture is the ideas, the values, the preferences, the skills and knowledge that flow socially. It's what we get from others. So we get language from others. We get religion from others. We get our fashion from others. So the value of culture is to give us what it takes to survive in a place physically and socially. So socially meaning how you speak. I mean, if you don't understand the same language, you'll have a hard time communicating. If you don't dress like everybody dresses, you will look weird and stick out, even though what looks weird to us in other people's dress is what's natural to them, and how we are looks weird to them, right?
Right.
And then the other part, so that's the social part, and then there's just the survival skills part.
Well, let's try to make this more specific if we can. So let's take something like the strong cultures like a French or Italian culture, because people would say, okay, the culture in Italy would be under food or artisanry, art, things like that. And so maybe you could delineate where you think it is culture and where it isn't in one of those like very knowable countries.
Right, right. Well, first of all, that's all Western culture. I mean, there's a lot of commonalities, and culture is sort of a nested thing. So,
Okay.
you know, Western culture has a lot of commonalities. We all more or less look and dress the same. We have the same sorts of, well, many of us are brought up in the same religion, or at least, you know, in the Christian tradition, and if not, almost certainly in the Abrahamic tradition, either Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, right? Mm-hmm. So those are some similarities that we all share culturally, but we get all of those things from other people. We were taught those things. They're not things that come to us naturally, and they answer the questions of how we live here. So if you are raised Christian and you go into a mosque, you don't really know what to do, right? If you don't speak the same language, you have a hard time communicating. And there are certain things, matters of etiquette. You know, in some countries, if you point your toes in the direction of somebody else, it's considered to be rude. We wouldn't know that, but if we were brought up in that culture, we would just do that as a matter of course. If you went to a Buddhist temple, you wouldn't even know what you were looking at. So these are some of the kinds of things that have to do with how we get along and interact socially. One of the main things that does is it lets us cooperate. We all understand the expectations. If you go to work for somebody in our culture, you expect money in exchange for your efforts. If they try to pay you with goods, you will probably say, you know, what's going on here? This is wrong. This is not what I expected. You're trying to cheat me. But in many cultures throughout most of human history, that would be the medium of exchange. Is I would do something or I would give you something. You would give me some goods rather than
okay. So
money.
You're looking at this more as all human culture of how we relate to each other and survive on this planet. So how would people refer to something that they colloquially would refer to as culture? Like, oh, I love the French culture around food and wine, for example.
Well,
British culture.
that's part of French culture is French food, French wine. Music is part of culture, and that varies from place to place or even generation to generation.
Okay.
It helps us understand who we are because we identify with others, and it gives us certain assumptions about how to act and how to cooperate with others. So those are some of the social aspects of culture. It answers the question of how do we live here, and the physical aspects have to do with things like, well, here's a good example. If you're raised in an indigenous tribe in the Amazon rainforest, you will know how to survive in the Amazon rainforest. If you're raised in the Arctic among traditional Inuit people, you would know how to survive in the Arctic. Take somebody raised in the Arctic, drop them in the Amazon, they'll be dead in a few days. Take somebody from the Amazon, drop them in the Arctic, they'll be dead in a few days. Either of them could have been raised in either place and known how to survive. But they learn the culture that answers the question, how do we live here? And it allows you to survive in a place. So that's a sort of an overview of culture and humanity. But it's similar in other species that have culture. The humans are the most cultural. There's no question about that. But up until a few years ago, a lot of people insisted that culture was only a human thing. And now what we know is that there are a bunch of other species, certainly not all, but a bunch of other species for whom learning how to live in a place is crucial to their survival. So let's start with the most cultural other species, which is chimpanzees. Imagine if you got a baby chimpanzee, you nursed it, raised it in a human home, and then you took it to the best chimpanzee habitat remaining in Africa, where wild chimpanzees live, and you left it there. It would not know anything about what to do. It would not be able to know where the food is, what to eat, how to get it, where the water is, what food to look for in different seasons. It would certainly not know how to interact socially with other chimpanzees. So what does a chimpanzee need to learn culturally? Everything. And that's why their childhood lasts about as long as ours. They're basically always with their mother until they're 9 years old or 10 years old or something like that. Right. And then they have a bit of an adolescence, and then they become adults in their mid to late teens, very similar to human beings. But everything they need to know about how to survive, they have to learn socially, first from their mother, and then by watching their mother interacting socially with other chimpanzees, and then watching other chimpanzees in their group and in their community to understand what is What is status about? How does a male, if you're a male, how does a male negotiate the social hierarchy? What do females do? What is the social life of females? How does it differ from males? Because it does differ a bit. And there's also culture in certain whales and dolphins. There's culture even in certain birds, in a number of mammals that live in groups. So we're starting in the last few decades to just learn that culture is very important to survival, not just in humans, but in other species as well.
Right. Yeah, because it's really fascinating how I think short-sighted humans can be in their understanding of the animal kingdom, whereas we don't want to extrapolate anything from us onto them, because I think we have this concept of human supremacy that we're at the top of the food chain, we're the smartest, we're the whateverist. It comes up every year. There's something else where we think we're grander than all the animals. However, if we
We're the
find
most insecure. That's why we have all those thoughts.
that is a great way to put it, because it's like even in that study that was misunderstood about wolves and alpha wolves, like people have been saying alpha male for I don't know a decade or two now, and this concept is so ubiquitous in society now of these alpha males, beta males, but the study itself was done on a wolf in captivity. And so what I understand of wolves now, after reading about things and listening to you on other shows, is that it seems like there's a strong family dynamic in wolves, in which there is a lot of cooperation within that. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. Well, the whole alpha thing is not only mistaken, as you say, it's an excuse for people to act badly to other people.
Right.
And say,
Speaking of insecure.
I'm the alpha, I'm the boss. I get to boss people around. I get to abuse people because that's my status. Well, wolves don't do that at all. What we unfortunately call a wolf pack is actually a nuclear family. It's mom and dad and their kids of the last several, usually 2 or 3 years. And then when the young ones become adolescent, they leave the family and try to find their own stake in the world, just like we do. And so wolf researchers don't use the term alpha or beta or any of these things.
Right.
Usually, if there's a male who is a leader, that's the dad. And generally speaking, the female, the mom, makes more of the decisions about when they're going to stop, when they're going to rest, when they're going to hunt, when they're going to travel. She tends to be the leader on most of those decisions. But all of the other ones are their children, and they look to their parents to see what to do. The so-called alpha male and female only lead by example because they know how to live. And what are the young ones trying to learn? They're trying to learn the culture of that pack. The culture of wolves doesn't extend to a lot of dimensions. For instance, they don't use tools, but they need to learn the limits of their territory. They need to learn which other wolf families are kind of okay at the borders, which are aggressive and dangerous to them. Some of them specialize in what to hunt, which requires, in some cases, very specialized skills. For instance, there is one wolf pack in Yellowstone that kills bison in the winter. Bison weigh about 10 times what any given wolf weighs. And sure. So the strategy for killing such a gigantic and dangerous animal is a skill that most other animals, most other wolves don't know how to do. In Michigan, I think it is, there's one pack that specializes in fishing. They walk around in streams and they know how to catch fish. Most wolves don't know how to do that. So that's part of their culture.
Wow. So it would depend where the wolves themselves are raised. They would have a different culture because it relates to how they survive and get food and
Right.
take care of each other.
Right, exactly.
Okay, and so I guess pulling on that thread a little bit, what do you think we might be on the cusp of learning about animals that maybe you suspect now, but there's not enough evidence gathering? Is there anything that, like, maybe through all of your observations and all the books that you've written, that there's kind of like a thread going through that you kind of feel like we're on the cusp of understanding?
Well, that thread is attached to a very, very big ball of yarn. And I would say that what I've most recently come to understand, which is the subject of an upcoming book that will be out in October, is that throughout human history, people in different cultural realms, and I would say there's four main cultural realms in humanity, and they are indigenous people who are land-based and very connected to their physical surroundings and the seasons and things like that. There's South Asian religious traditions, most of which are related to one another. There's East Asian, which are religious traditions, some of which overlap with South Asia, some of which are distinct, like Confucianism, not really a religion, a philosophy about life. And then there's the West. Those are the four. The other three always assumed that the earth and everything on it was sacred. They always assumed that the value of all living things was equivalent, and that all living things had equivalent souls, and that to the extent that humans are special, our special responsibility was to maintain the balances of the world and not upset them. The West is a tremendous outlier in that regard. We have been raised with the cultural indoctrination that the world has no value, that no other creatures have souls that we imagine ourselves alone to have, and that perfection exists off this planet outside of space and time, and that we should yearn to get there by dying. That's a big difference. So you're asking me, what have I learned about, what do I think we're going to learn about animals next and things like that? I think the main problem is we don't value our existence. We don't understand that the world in every conceivable way and many inconceivable ways is an absolute, it defies description, but it's an absolute what's the word for this? Let's say it's a cavalcade. That's a word that comes to mind. It's a procession, a parade of miracle upon miracle upon miracle embedded in miracles that are so far outside of the ability of people to comprehend that we have only, in the last few decades, out of all humans have been around as humans for something like 300,000 years. And it's in about the last 100, and certainly only the last 200, that we have had any inkling of the fact that the world changes, that living things change through time, any inkling about how old the planet is, something about how the planet may have formed, something about the universe and its infinite dimensions, all of these things, and most of them are really impossible for a human to grasp, except in the vaguest outlines. If you, If you want to know everything that is known about any one of these tiny threads, you have to spend your entire life as a specialist hoping desperately to keep up with all the information that is being uncovered. And what is the consequence of the fact that it's impossible for most people to do that? The consequence is that we are demolishing the ability of this planet to sustain life. And what do I mean by that? Well, almost every animal in the world is at its lowest population level since humans arrived and is declining pretty rapidly. North America has lost 3 billion birds since I was in high school. Things
3
like
billion, like across all the different species?
Across all the different species. Yeah, we have a list of endangered species that are down to a few thousand, but for the hundreds of species that live in North America, their populations are basically all supposed to be way up in the millions, and many of them have declined by half.
And
so you say, well, there's still...
Sorry, is this just the encroachment of human civilization on the natural world, mainly?
It's
or is
partly
it pollution and things like that?
Well, yes. I mean, if you include pollution, then the answer is a flat out and very simple yes. Most of it is that we occupy more land. I mean, one thing is, in my lifetime, the human population has tripled. And the way that most of us live involves using more and more stuff per person, and everybody in the world seems to want more stuff per person. So our footprint individually is much bigger. And I mean, you can just look around. Many places that were undeveloped when I was a kid are full of houses or highways or things like that now, and they're just gone. And with them is everything that used to live there. 96% of all the living mammals on Earth are now human beings and our domestic livestock. Only 4% of all mammals in the world are wild.
And by domestic livestock, do you mean what we consume or pets?
Both, but it's overwhelmingly it's cows and pigs. Overwhelming.
Right. Yeah, I'm not. I definitely don't want to put words in your mouth. And people listening to this show are pretty familiar with my contempt for religion. And so what I hear is that we have so many, true natural miracles on planet Earth here, but instead the majority of the world has decided that the miracles all come off of this planet from this land that we've made up, which is a heaven or a hell or whatever these things may be, and that potentially could be leading to this level of human supremacy, and when you said that it seems like we have no value for our world, like I feel like someone punched me in the gut, because it's so true, but I've never heard it said so flatly, directly before. Like,
it's very explicitly stated in a lot of the, especially some of the early Christian theologians like Augustine and people like that. And even back to Plato. And all this stuff is the subject of my upcoming book. But Plato explicitly said that we need to ignore the world, and we need to ignore our corrupting and our basically rotting bodies, and yearn to get to the perfection that he imagined. Plato imagined these perfected forms, and they were outside space and time. And he thought that our thinking comes from our soul. Our soul has had personal experience with perfection, and it comes to inhabit us when we are born, and it is an eternal soul. This idea got into Judaism and Christianity through Platonist Jewish philosophers and the earliest Christian theologians, who were literally reading and talking about Plato, and it became slightly translated into the view of perfection off the world became the Christian view of heaven. This is the value basis of Western civilization. It's the basis for the catastrophe that we are committing on life and on this planet. And I think if you look at numbers, it's not quite true, as you said, that the majority of people believe this. But Western civilization, not because it had a better idea, but because it was the least the least restrained in its use of violence to inflict its ideas on other people, or simply to wipe them out when it encountered other people, spread. And most of the people in the world are not believers in the Abrahamic tradition. I think fewer than half. But the Abrahamic values, as translated into our monetary system and what we think things are worth, and how we, how we mine and how we use fossil fuels and all these things, with no compunction about the effects on the rest of life. This monetary system and this valuation have globalized, and so almost the entire world has bought into the devaluation of the world. Right. That's how I currently understand it.
Yeah, that rings very true to me. So it's kind of like this idea of extractive capitalism that we live through right now. You're saying has kind of taken a lot of its foundational roots from these ideas that maybe have gone as far back as Plato, to say that the real, utopia is afterlife, and this world is just to be used for human consumption for whatever we need.
Right. And I would also say it's not that capitalism is the problem.
Right.
It's capitalism in the service of cultures that do not value life on Earth is the problem. It's the values that's the problem. The values are Western, and they come from the Platonist and Abrahamic tradition, which basically get everything from each other for the most part.
Right. Well, and there's something to be said about capitalism in the last 50 years as well, saying how companies, for example, used to be looked upon to take care of their community, to take care of employees, to make sure people were employed and were able to live with a certain amount of dignity. That, I'm sure, in collaboration with unions. But it seems like after Jack Welch started taking over and kind of using it for financial manipulation to, only look at shareholder value and profit, opposed to looking at how the community or the environment was involved, it seems capitalism has shifted after his tenure on the stage. So it seems like there's all these iterations that continue to go to value money and not valuing the world or the people less and less. And I hope we're regressing a little bit back to something that's more ethically centered. But I don't know if I'd hold my breath on that.
Well, what you're talking about has some deeper roots, and what I think is the inflection point on capitalism. Capitalism was more or less invented in the 1200s. What I think is the inflection point for the modern era, or at least one of the important inflection points, is that Henry Ford had the Ford Motor Company. He was partners with two brothers whose last name was Dodge. They eventually formed the Dodge Motor Company. But before they left Ford was very idealistic about the ability of a company to create wealth for a community and for its workers. And he wrote about that and his desire to have his company bring a much better life to the workers. The Dodge brothers sued him for not giving a bigger share of the profits to the shareholders. They won in court, where the judge said that the reason for the existence of a corporation is to maximize the return to shareholders. If that judge had said the opposite, things would be very different now. So that was a major inflection point that helped to create, in the modern business world, a totally rapacious approach.
Right. Wow. I'm gonna have to look up that case, because that's fascinating.
I mention it in one of my books called The View from Lazy Point, and the citations in that book will tell you where I got it from, but I'm sure they're very easily Googleable. You know, I'm sure you can easily look up online some of the history of this.
Right.
Because I did that when I was writing the book. I got that all online.
Okay. A topic I wanted to come back to on animals is, it seems I would say most humans look at any animal species as a monolith. Like, pigs do this, birds do this, and it seems like you want to make the case that, like human beings, animals are also individuals, and I would argue that a lot of humans also look at each other in generalities. I know I'm guilty of stereotyping sometimes, and I have to think through these things, and so I wonder where you've gathered evidence of what you've seen to say that animals are individuals as humans might be.
Well, we do all make these generalizations, even of human beings, right? We say, that the French do this, the French have better food than the English, or whatever it is, or much worse, we use this for our biases that are an excuse for oppressing people, and we just lump everybody together, and we certainly do that with other species. If you are ever in intimate contact with individuals of other species, you see that they all have personality differences. And I'm reading a book right now called The Mind of a Bee, and it talks about what's been discovered in recent years about individual differences in the personalities of bumblebees.
Wow.
It's pretty amazing. If you back way up from that to vertebrates, I mean, I can tell you, like, for instance, we have 3 dogs. They're being very good right now because they're all in the same room with me, and they're staying quiet.
Sure,
so
the mind of a bee.
Right, the mind of a bee. The dogs have totally different personalities, and you could say, well, dogs do this, and dogs are like this. But within a generalization or two, there are tremendous differences that are individual, and they're all like different family members, really.
Right.
They all respond differently. They have little differences in how smart they are or what things they are responsive toward. I used to be a falconer. I used to work with hawks, and individual hawks and falcons are different. They hunt a little differently. Some of them respond to, all of them will respond to the person that is working with them a little bit differently. And I think, parrots, the same thing. They're all a little different if you get to know them. And I think that there's a lot of this. In fact, what I've learned in researching my book, Becoming Wild, which is about culture in non-humans, is that in every species where personality has been looked for. And what is personality? Personality is when you're presented with the same stimulus, you respond differently, consistently differently. In every species where personality has been looked for, down to spiders and insects, personality has been found. This, to me, is kind of surprising, because before I went into that investigation for that book, I had written a book called Beyond Words. And that book was about what other animals think and feel. And at the end of writing that book, my question was, well, at what point in the animal kingdom does awareness and thinking begin? It's certainly in all vertebrates you can see some of it or a lot of it. And I was like, insects, I don't know. What about insects? If you watch a spider, it seems like they're very aware of what's going on. You watch a spider outside doing something, it acts very differently than a spider that's trying to figure out how to get out of a sink. It seems like they're aware. And what we seem to be learning most recently is that yes, if you do it experimentally and very scientifically, it seems like they're aware, they learn, they have individual differences in how they respond to certain situations. And that is pretty mind-boggling, because what counts as the brain in a spider or in a bee is obviously much, much, much smaller than it is in a human being. But it apparently it does not take billions of neurons to have a thought or to be aware in the way that we would understand awareness in the world around you.
Right. Well, it seems like, just taking off a line from human supremacy, we're just so full of ourselves and so consumed with our own lives and family members and social circles and our culture that it seems like we dismiss the idea that these animals could have similar relations to each other. Like there's so much evidence in that, and like
Right.
An author I spoke to a couple months ago is saying that we used to think that 98% of our DNA was just junk and the 2% was what we understood. But now we know that that's completely false, and that 98%, surprise, surprise, has value and function. So there seems to be something with the human mind that it's just, there's some magical maybe or lazy thinking or blind spots where what we don't presently know, most people will simply dismiss, where it seems, it's really refreshing to me that it seems like you want to see what's in the middle of that yarn ball, and you keep pulling, which I appreciate.
Yeah, and I would say it's not the human mind, it's the Western mind, and it's the Western culture that decided centuries ago that we are the pinnacle, we are the only thing that matters. The whole world was put here for us to use up, to use up.
Right.
And there are a lot of people who cannot wait for the end of the world.
Well, I think that's another type
Now,
entirely.
but that's only a Western thing. Other people never thought stuff like that.
Asian cultures aren't like that, because I know they go through, obviously with their population, they go through animals on a much higher level than the Western world. But don't they have the same idea of afterlife?
Well, I wouldn't compare the modern Asian economy, which is basically our economy globalized, to what their foundational values have been about. Because to a certain large extent, they've turned their back on their traditional values in order to compete in the modern world. But traditionally, you had there were a lot of people, a lot of traditions in Asia where you did not eat meat. All of them, pretty much, I think all of them thought that to the extent that there are eternal souls, those souls go through in reincarnations. They go through all levels of different kinds of living things. In Hinduism, it's explicit that humans and other living things are equivalent in value. You have the Jains, who, if you're really devout Jain, you go through life with a mask over your mouth to make sure that you are not going to accidentally inhale an insect, and you sweep the path in front of you to not step on a bug. Those values would operate very differently. And in fact, in the modern world, like in North America, where native people have acquired outboard motors and chainsaws and guns, they still use a lot of restraint that they are taught culturally about the value of the world and about not abusing their ability to take and use things and to do things like, to thank the spirit of an animal that they have just killed if they're hunting, and those kinds of things. More traditionally, there would be all kinds of prayers and preparations for a hunt, to ask for the creatures to present themselves to basically kind of like give the humans a break, because the humans need to hunt these animals, and then to thank them, to treat their weapons as sacred objects, right, to treat the remains of animals they've killed, including their bones, as sacred, and not to disrespect the remains. All kinds of things that to us are totally alien, because we're taught not to care.
Right. And I guess I'd be curious to hear your opinion on, because you see now in the zeitgeist, there is a big discussion going on between like meat eaters, like people that consider themselves carnivores, which is kind of funny to me, the vegans and the vegetarians, and then in between like your flexitarians. And how would you look at this conversation? Because, obviously I think some of us in the West are privileged that if we want to choose to be vegan, vegetarian, whereas if there was a famine, or you were living in an area that doesn't have like a supply line system where you're getting all the vegetables you need from all over the world, you're getting all the meat you need, and there's an abundance of food, you'd be forced to eat whatever you could get your hands on, be it animal or plant-based. So how do you think about the food system itself, or even the food chain, as it were?
Yeah. Well, I wrote about this in an article called What I Eat. That's on the Huffington Post, if anybody wants to check that out. And my views are kind of as follows. One is that everything dies. So I don't actually think that killing something is the worst thing that could be done. However, the way we raise animals is that we make them live much worse than we make them die. Mm-hmm. And so for the most part, our food system is a complete nightmare. With animals, it's clearly a nightmare, and most people can relate to that because they understand cruelty and they understand suffering. But the way we raise vegetables and grain is also completely catastrophic. The scale of it has taken habitat from billions and billions of other animals, is the main reason that other animals are endangered and that everything is in decline. And most of it uses a tremendous amount of fossil fuels, phosphate fertilizers, which are polluting the freshwater and coastal waterways of the world. And that too is a nightmare. So what does a person do? Well, there's better and there's worse. Better is if you can get your food locally from small-scale people, or grow a lot of it yourself, or maybe even hunt or catch some of your food. I do a lot of fishing. Why is it okay with me that I do a lot of fishing? For a couple of reasons, but the main reason in regard to this conversation is that if I catch a fish, yes, I cause pain to the fish. I don't deny that. And I wrote an article in The Guardian about, I think that article is called, "Are We Wrong to Assume Fish Can't Feel Pain?" The answer is fish feel pain. I wrote about that.
I read that article.
But I go fishing because if I catch a fish, I don't diminish the ability of the ocean to make another fish. But if I buy broccoli, wherever that broccoli is grown, you can't have birds and mammals there. They can't live there anymore. Their habitat is gone. So everything is a trade-off, and everything involves ethical decisions. In my personal life, I'm very lucky because we live on the coast and I can catch fish. I can go and dig clams. That's our animal part of our food supply. I don't buy farm raised meat, and I basically try to avoid any animal product that comes off a farm and ends up as offered for food. I basically avoid that. The only exception is if I go to someone's home and they've made meat for dinner, I just usually eat it. And often they know that I don't really like eating meat, so they make pasta or something else for me. But if it's, if it's a big family thing for a holiday or something, and there's meat as the main course, I don't think it's important enough at that moment to make the host feel uncomfortable or that I don't appreciate their efforts.
Yeah, I'm very similar in that respect.
But in our own house, it's different. We get to choose. We have some chickens. We have 5 chickens right now. They're completely free range all day. They're not restricted in any way from where they can go. They're in really good shape. They lay eggs like crazy. They go into a really nice coop at night where they're safe from predators. So we eat a lot of their eggs. We eat the fish and the clams that I catch, and we have a vegetable garden. Until a couple of years ago, where we were living, there wasn't enough light. It was too shady to have a decent vegetable garden. Now we have a decent vegetable garden, and right down the block from where we live is a really good greengrocer who grows most of her food, and I like to go there a lot. So, like I say, there's better and there's worse. And there's a lot of worse things involved in food as well that are not exactly about how they're grown or how much cruelty is involved. Plastic packaging is a big part of food decisions. What comes in the hard plastic? What can you just go with a used plastic bag and put a head of lettuce in there and take it to the checkout? I mean, there are many layers to trying to decide how to do it better. And it's impossible to do it perfectly.
Right. Yeah, that's a great message. I think a lot of people will make fun of people using these cloth bags and all these things, but I think it's a great movement that, like, if you can do something, do something. And I think obviously, like with the Janes with the masks over their mouth to avoid, like, obviously I think that would be extreme for 99% of us, but there is a huge spectrum for what we can and cannot do in this world. And so, yeah, I think we should bring a lot of light to that for, what humans are doing just based on our consumption.
Right. And I mean, like, just what you were saying about the Janes, I just told you I go fishing because there's a trade-off in my food supply, but I don't kill spiders if they're in my house. I either say you can stay there, it's fine because you're eating the other bugs that are in the house. Or if for some reason I find a spider and I don't, if it's in the sink or whatever, often I'll just take it outside and let it go. And we all make these kinds of decisions all the time, or we decide by not deciding.
Right. Yeah. Non-decision is another choice, and that's
right.
It's a great reminder. I do want to be respectful of your time. So the last question that I'd love to hear from you on is, I heard you speak somewhere else about the importance of beauty to human life and your view on beauty. And I'd really love to hear you speak on that, because I remember the early days when I started moving to Europe and I lived in several different cities. And when I'd go home back to Canada, I'd have some, dinners with friends and have some conversations. And I would be like, yeah, the architecture is so amazing, this and that. And, I remember some people making fun because, Toronto is kind of like, it's not an ugly city, but it really doesn't have the sort of charm that, let's say, older cities do in Europe with the architecture and the even older churches and things like that. There's a thoughtfulness in the city planning on this side of the Atlantic, like anywhere from, Vienna to Italy to anywhere. Like they want there to be an aesthetic where people live their lives, and I do not see that in Canada. And in some places, sure. And so I definitely see a difference for my day-to-day life living here opposed to living there. And so I would love to hear your take on why you think beauty is an essential part of human life, or should be.
Well, first of all, I'm noticing from what you're saying that you would rather live in Barcelona than in Toronto, partly because of the the aesthetic aspects of the physical built surroundings, right? Built by people.
Yeah,
You
sure.
like that better, right?
Yeah, every day I can walk by a place that I've been 100 times, but I still enjoy it because it is a beautiful place to be. Mind
Yeah,
you, if this place also had 7 months of winter, maybe would reevaluate that. But yes, like I totally agree.
yeah. So here's I think the the most foundational thing about this topic is if you think of a feather is just a structure that an animal's DNA manages to make. It has a physical patterning, it has a chemical composition. It's just a thing. You could say that inherent to that feather is a certain amount of carbon, is a certain repeating pattern. Those are properties of the feather. What is not a property of the feather is whether or not it's beautiful. That is only a judgment that happens within a mind. And that means that the mind somehow has the capacity for aesthetic judgment. Why have minds evolved a capacity for aesthetic judgments and aesthetic preferences? Most of the feathers that we see as beautiful, most of the flowers that we see as beautiful, are only beautiful because our mind is constantly making a judgment about these things. Our mind thinks that flowers are more beautiful than roots, for instance. Our mind thinks that feathers are more beautiful than a bird's foot, for instance. So it's our mind making these judgments. And then, so the question is, why do minds have aesthetic capacities? What other minds have aesthetic capacities? Well, all of the things that are attracted to feathers, like birds are attracted to feathers. That's why birds have all these patterns and all these bright colors and things like that.
Right.
They evolved because they're attractive to prospective mates. Flowers evolved entirely to attract pollinators. Pollinators are drawn to flowers because they find them attractive. What gets mystical is that things that have no practical value for us, like bird feathers and the scent of a flower. I mean, we're not pollinators. We're not descended from insects. We don't have pollinators as our ancestors. Why do we find flowers visually beautiful and beautiful smelling? Why is it that most people's favorite colors are blue or green, the most common colors in the natural world? Not some exotic, rare color, but the most common colors. So those are big questions. Then if you think, well, what if we had no aesthetic sense of the world? What if we got no pleasure from the sky, from the color of leaves, from the look of flowers, from the sight or sound of birds? If we got no pleasure from the world around us, we would be left with all the difficulty of trying to stay alive. Why would we bother? I think that the ability to perceive things as beautiful is something that has evolved in order to make life worth the effort it takes, because it's hard to stay alive. And beauty, I think, is the reason for living. We often, you say your friends sometimes laugh at you for being so taken with architecture and things like that. What we often do, especially in the West, is we degrade beauty and we say, oh, that's just an aesthetic consideration. We're about practicality. Well, that's another kind of a catastrophic thing that really denies what are some of the best things about the human mind, our ability to see things as beautiful. Why is it that artists and musicians are always struggling to make a living? And people want you to play music and not pay for it, and yet are willing to pay a lawyer $500 an hour. This is like an inversion of the values of why we even care to be alive.
Right.
Is to try to be close to the things that we find beautiful.
Right. And
And love and our family is those are aesthetic perceptions of beauty that come from the same sense.
right. Well, it really goes to show what we do value, as you mentioned, because it's no surprise that there is kind of this epidemic of anxiety and depression that's starting to happen as people have. I think we become more and more aware with every generation, and also we also realize like how many bullshit jobs there are out there that people are doing and they don't want to do, but you have to do because we live in this culture that you have to pay rent, you have to do these things, but to do them you kind of have to sacrifice the majority of your life to live. And so the small time you may have off or your time between work and weekends, that's the time where you can enjoy your life. And I think people are getting more and more fed up spending so much time in things that don't provide them with value, with love, with enjoyment. So they're even considering in many countries pushing back to 4 days a week of work, which I think makes complete sense. And so are you seeing these things in animal cultures as well, or is that kind of too hard to decipher without being able to speak with these animals directly?
Well, I think what I see is that there are aesthetic perceptions and choices made on those perceptions very widely across the animal kingdom. All of the things that have to do with colors and patterns in birds are about choosing mates. These are aesthetic preferences, and habitat choice, where certain kinds of animals go and want to hang out. These are aesthetic choices. So they have these perceptions, and they want to spend time near things that are aesthetically appealing to them. That is a big part of why animals choose to be where they are or choose to mate with who they mate with.
Okay, that's great. I appreciate that, and I'm looking forward to the next book as well as you keep pulling on that thread. So, with that, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and all your hard work, opening up the animal and natural world to those of us who want to learn more about it.
Well, Michael, thank you very, very much for having me, and it's been a delight talking to you.
Likewise. Take care. So thanks for listening to No More, No Less. I appreciate the time you spent with me today. So please subscribe and rate the show if you enjoyed it. It'll help me create more amazing content and get that next little bit of validation that I so deeply crave. If you did enjoy it, well, that sucks. But to make sure, I think you should listen to my next 10 episodes and then decide. I mean, come on. Rome was not built in a day. I'm just getting warmed up here, guys. So thanks again. See you next time.